first
Not
part.
the handful of property.
That light is blinding.
Can you go turn it out?
Yeah, it's great.
It's full.
All right. That light is blinding you. Can you just bring that light in a little bit? Oh, no, please, no.
So you said there's like three seconds.
And I think there's a great thing after Warren, if you're ready to ask the first talk. After my talk, then I can show you. Yeah, they're going to get us all up there.
All right.
As long as you're talking kids style, right?
Good evening, folks. I'm going to interrupt all your conversations and start off the evening. Firstly, thank you so much. It's amazing to see how many people actually came out for our little robotic event in support of the QE2 Foundation. My name is Warren Connors. I am an underwater robotic scientist. I'm a recipient of 2 surgeries on my kidneys using this robot, actually, the Da Vinci robot, here in Halifax. And because of that, I'm a kidney cancer survivor. So I'm... No. Clap for the surgeon that actually did the work. I just fell asleep. So, and it's my distinct pleasure to be able to be the host for the next 3 nights of A Pint of Robotics. The whole idea behind A Pint of Robotics really sprung from a couple of things. And one was simply that a lot of people don't think of Halifax as a hotbed for robotic innovation. But the funny part is there's actually robotics work that's going on underwater, terrestrial robotics, in the air, and of course medicine and in space. So what we wanted to do, of course, was to try and bring together a casual talk series about some of the innovative work that's actually happening here in our own backyards by trying to do a really intimate and hopefully interactive evening talking about robotics. So the idea is it's going to be split over the next 3 weeks. Starting tonight, we'll have a couple of speakers. Next Tuesday, we'll have 3 speakers. And then finally, the 19th, I believe it is, we'll have a couple more. Before we really get kicked up, though, got to go through a couple of housekeeping items. I'll start with the one we really want to all see is COVID. We're all sick of it. It's weird just being in a bar with this many people, but we do have to still respect some simple rules. So if you're getting up and you're moving around, please, put a mask on. The tables have been spaced out as much as they can, given the number of people we have here. So if you can respect where the tables are, that would be great. And of course, you probably saw from the invitation, unfortunately, the dance floor is closed. So if our talks, get you to the point where you want to dance, just try and do it next to your table. The idea is for everybody to have a drink, have some food. So you're probably wondering where the washrooms are. So just go to the end of the bar here, hang a left, and you'll see the signs. You'll also notice that there's a couple of cameras here. This shouldn't be too much of an issue, but we're live streaming this event for folks who weren't able to be here. Some folks, that's due to geographic, some folks due to scheduling. So if you can, if you're standing up, please just be cognizant of the field of the view of cameras so that people who are watching from home can also see it. So tonight's format is all based around the idea of having just casual talks about robotics. So we're not going to slam you with, heavy talks about science or anything like that. It's 2 20 to 25-minute talks about robotics. So as we move on, I'm going to give you a short talk right now, which is an introductory talk. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the QE2 Foundation and what it means to me and why I'm here. And then we're going to take a tiny little break so everybody can grab some food, grab a drink, and Dr. Michael Dunbar is going to give a talk. And he's doing some really cool stuff with knees and robotics, so I'm really interested to see that one. Following that, we're going to take another little break, and Dave Shea's going to talk from Kraken Robotics. You'll notice that I didn't really mention about questions. And the original idea when we started talking about this was that we would do questions very interactively, right? We'd hand around a mic and everybody could, have some questions, and we'd have a panel chat between the 2 speakers and myself. Unfortunately, though, because of COVID, it's a bit challenging to send a mic around. So what we've actually decided to do is we've used something called Slido. So for some people who have worked from home, they're kind of used to working with Slido, but effectively it's just a website. So from your phone or your tablet, you can just go there and you can submit questions, right? I'll show you a link in a few minutes, but there's also a link that was attached with your invitation that was sent out yesterday to come here. So I would highly encourage you to ask questions. One of the fun parts for myself as a scientist, and I'm sure for both of the other speakers, is to hear some of the questions and the perspectives that people are giving, right? We're not here, like I said, to give, heavy science talks. I'm not going to dazzle you with mathematics. But the idea is to really talk about some of the cool stuff that's going on. So please, definitely submit questions. And of course, don't know if you know this or not, but this is a fundraising event. So, I'm not just singing for my supper here. What we'd like to do, you'll see a link, and on all the tables there's a QR code. If you're enjoying the evening, if you're enjoying learning about what robotics are going on here and also what the QE2 Foundation is doing to save or change people's lives, then please, donate to the QE2 Foundation. So I do, with that, want to talk a tiny bit about the QE2 Foundation, what it means to me, and why we're here tonight. So the QE2 Foundation's been around for about 25 years, and it's a non-for-profit that's focused on supporting the Health Sciences Center here. For people who aren't from around here, it's a large kind of conglomerate of hospitals, and it's the largest in the region, right? There are a lot of people who have had specialized treatment and had to travel to here, to this facility. So I want to talk a little bit about a few of the numbers that really stood out to me and motivated me to do this. And this is the first one. It's 1 million patients visit the QE2 Health Sciences Center each year. 1 million patients. So if anybody spends too much time on Wikipedia, I have, there's 970,000 people in this province. 1 million people every year. So that means everybody here plus 30,000 New Brunswickers went to the hospital every single year. You think about that number, you think about the scope of treatments that are required, the scale of that operation. It's amazing. And that shows you why we need organizations like the QE2 Foundation. $250 million. I'm a government scientist. That is an incomprehensible number to me. $250 million has been raised. And not just raised by large corporations, but raised by people like all the people that are sitting here, right? To improve healthcare, to fund education, to fund research, to buy new equipment. $250 million. It's a massive number. So I want to talk just a tiny bit about what, at least recently, some of that is funding. One of the big ones is a hybrid OR. And this is really quite cool. The idea is they've built this technologically advanced operating room, which has capabilities that they didn't previously have. So they can do diagnostic imaging and at the same time, have the capability to flexibly switch between non-invasive and open surgeries. So this is really giving the surgeons and the surgical teams a lot of flexibility to give the best care they possibly can for people. Another one is cancer therapy. As I said before, I live in this. One of the things that happens to you when you find out you have cancer is there's a clock that starts ticking. And you think about it. The time for your next treatment, the time for your next scan, the time for, and it goes on and on. So by partnering with government, the QE2 Foundation has effectively funded a new cancer therapy prep lab, which is allowing them to increase the throughput of people going through, right? Which means it's cutting the wait times. And as somebody who thinks about those things, that's huge. That's improving the quality of life for people. And of course, that's Da Vinci. I have a special relationship with this robot. The surgical robotics program is funded $8.1 million by people. This robot is the robot that operated on me twice. So it's mostly focused now on prostate, gynecological, kidney, and ear, nose, and throat cancers. And the thing to note, and I think this will come up as a theme throughout the entire week, is that we use robotics to enhance the capabilities that we have. The robot's not replacing the talented surgeon, right? The robot's amplifying the capabilities of that talented surgeon. And I think that's something that people should know. Because when we think about trusting these robotics and things like that, there still is someone on the other end, right? As a bit of a joke, though, in 2 weeks, when my surgeon's here, he did 2 kidney cancer surgeries. Look at the size of his hands. I'm glad we had that robot working on me. So Dr. Michael Dunbar, who's actually going to speak in a few minutes, he had this quote. He says, there's no area of medicine, robotics, has entered that it hasn't improved? I guess I would argue, as an underwater robotics scientist, that there's no area that robotics has entered that it hasn't improved the quality of life for us, right? And that's something I hope you walk away from as you gain an appreciation for some of the amazing work that's happening here in Atlantic Canada. This number is really personal. 20,000. 20,000 community members contribute every year to the QE2 Foundation. So this number was really humbling for me, and I'll tell you why. A couple of years ago, I was on top of the world. I was, just moved back a couple of years ago. I was looking at settling back into Halifax, buying a house. My wife Amy and I were having a great time, and we were out one night, feeling a bit odd when I was coming home, and didn't really think about it. I'm 40 years old. Like, I always feel odd. So I got home and went to bed, and about 4 or 5 hours later, I woke up and I was in pain, right? And sometimes you have a pain where you're like, ugh, what is that? Sometimes you have a pain that you know something's wrong, and this was the latter. So I said to Amy, I said, there's something seriously wrong, and we went right to the hospital. And the funny part is I automatically felt comfortable. I mean, the QE2 Health Sciences Center is massive, and the people that are there are talented people. So when I got there, I was still comfortable. We were still joking. I was in a bit cranky of a mood. But I talked to the doctor, and he said, oh, well, it looks like you've got kidney stones. Well, that sucks. But it's not really that bad, right? Like, I'd heard stories about people trying to pass them, and I wasn't really looking forward to that. But at the end of the day, it wasn't that big of a deal. So they sent me off for a CAT scan, and I came back, and the doctor came in, and you could tell as soon as he came in, something was different. And he said, well, you don't have kidney stones. I said, okay, well, that's good. He said, you have a large mass on your right kidney, and you have a very large mass on your left kidney. And he said, we think they're cancer. And it's hard to explain how you react. I'm sure the doctors in the room would be like, well, you were in shock, which it probably was. But, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Like, my face was flushed. The room was quiet. I remember, Amy holding my hand. She was crying, and I didn't really hear anything else for a few minutes. So then he was talking about, oncology and people, and I was going to have to do this and go home and do this, and, and it just passed through. A little while later, a doctor came in, a doctor by the name of Sandra Kim. And it was amazing because she said, are you Warren Connors? So I was like, yeah. She said, you're not going anywhere. I was over here doing a consult. I saw your file. We've got you. So it's a funny thing because if you go to the QE2, you'll see these posters that the foundation puts up. And it says, we've got you. I can't see that poster without tearing up. Because that was the first kind of lifeline, right? That was the worst day of my life. So, but all of a sudden things were starting to turn. She sat with me and she started telling me about some of the advanced capabilities that they had here through the urology group, through the QE2 and through Dahazi, and advanced capabilities that were funded by the foundation. Fast forward a bit, it was a blur of tests and biopsies. I wouldn't recommend that, by the way. And all these different things. And then, what was it 4 weeks later, 4 or 5 weeks later, I was in my first surgery. So that's the first time I got to meet Da Vinci. What was incredible was, you get on the internet and you start reading about, okay, well, kidneys, blah, 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 and the doctor was focused on trying to remove the kidney, or remove the tumor from the kidney, because I was only 42 at the time. So he said, we can't just take both your kidneys out. So we needed to look at how we could treat that. So I went in, I woke up, for me it was easy, right? I took a nap, I got up. I was a rough wake up, but I still woke up, and all of a sudden, by the end of the night, they had me standing up. They had me walking around, right? And if you look at some of the old kidney surgeries where the guy's got a rib missing and he's got all this stuff going on, I was fine, right? A couple days after that, literally 3 days after that, so they took 2/3 of my kidney out, took the tumor out, stitched it all up. It probably looks like cauliflower, but got it all sorted and sent me home. And I was fine, right? Beauty of that was I healed up really quickly, thanks to that robot. And then I was able to do the second surgery. The second surgery was a little bit easier. I was home in 2 days, right? 2 days. Some guy went in around my belly button, fixed something back here, and I was home in 2 days. 2 weeks after that, 2.5 weeks after that, I was back at work, right? You think about that, right? These surgeries that people would be down for months before, right? But this capability allowed me to be back at work. Why should you care? Well, a couple of weeks, no, not even a couple of weeks, less than a week later, we were all sent home because of COVID. And if you remember, I was talking about how, when you find out you have cancer, it's a ticking clock. You're always thinking about time, right? Well, when they sent me home, if I hadn't had that second surgery, I may not have had it for a long time. And I don't know what would have happened then, right? So the ability to do these non-invasive surgeries and get me in and get me out allowed me to get treated before. In a couple of weeks, you're going to hear from Agnes Riddell. She actually had the same thing during COVID, and they were able to do those surgeries because of this capability, right? So when I got out, what was really shocking was, I found out that robot wasn't some big federal government program that a guy was going to get elected on. It wasn't, a provincial government program. It was those 20,000 people. It was people who dug into their pockets, who I don't know, I'll never know, but wanted to do that to support the QE2 Foundation. And by that, they didn't just save me, but they increased my quality of life because I didn't lose my kidneys. I've got 1/3 on one side and 2/3 on the other, so I sum it up, I've got a kidney. So that number was so humbling to me, and it was so humbling to Amy, and this is why we're here, because that's what really motivated me to want to do this. The other thing that really happened, though, was I was telling colleagues, robotics colleagues, and they were like, well, I didn't know we had that. And then one day I was talking to my surgeon, and I started telling him about what we were up to over at DRDC or over at Kraken or places like that. And he was like, well, I didn't know we did that. I thought, wow, there's a great story to be told here, because a lot of people don't understand some of the advanced robotics that are going on here, right? So that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm trying to do it, is that 20,000. So like I said, beyond medicine, there's some incredible stuff that's going on here in robotics. And hopefully tonight, next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after, you have an opportunity to get a bit of an awareness of some of the cool stuff that's happening right here. The speakers are going to be from medicine, from academia, industry, and government labs, and they're all doing or using advanced robotics here. Tonight, Dr. Michael Dunbar is going to give a talk. So he's from orthopedic robotics at the QE2. He's going to talk about advancing reliable, individualized orthopedic surgery at the QE2 through surgical robotics. So, this is pretty neat, right? Especially for a guy like me who's, underwater robotics. And then Dave Shea is going to talk. He's Senior Vice President of Engineering at Kraken, which is a robotics company that started in Atlantic Canada and has just grown like a weed. And he's going to talk about maritime robotics and what it is, how it works, and why it matters. So, like I said before, as I'm wrapping up, the Slido link should be with your invitation. Please submit your questions. That's really where you can ask, and you know what? It's anonymous. So don't worry about the question you're answering or the question you're asking. And like I said, if you can, take the time and donate now, because you'd be surprised how many lives it can actually change. So I'm going to take a little break, and then we're going to set up for Dr. Mike Dunbar. Thanks, folks.
sail alone, and no one would ever know. Oh, the snow was high again in the year of 1910 when I rode over Kelly's top and let go. O'er the mountain I had come without rapier, without gun, fetched my father's old pharmacy store. As I purchased my supplies, a pretty maiden caught my eye. Beauty shone upon me like the sun. As my heart melted away,
folks. Glad to see everybody stuck around. I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Michael Dunbar, who will be giving a talk on knee surgeries, which is pretty cool. Michael Dunbar is an orthopedic surgeon trained at Dow with a subspecialty training in arthroplasty from the University of Western Ontario. He completed his PhD in Lund, Sweden, as a member of the Swedish Knee Arthroplasty Registry. I could be saying that word wrong. I'm just concentrating on subjective outcomes after knee replacement surgery. He is the co-chair of the Canadian Joint Replacement Registry, past president and director of research at the Canadian Arthroplasty Society, member of and past chair of the membership and research committees of the Knee Society. His credits include the 2010 J. Edward Sampson Award for Outstanding Canadian Orthopedic Researcher over a 5-year period. He was named as one of the top 22 North American knee surgeons by his peers and one of the 10 orthopedic surgeon tech entrepreneurs to know by Becker's Spine Review. In 2015, he was awarded the inaugural QE2 Endowed Chair of Arthroplasty Outcomes at Dalhousie University with the overarching mandate of improving arthroplasty care and outcomes in Nova Scotia. In 2017, he was inducted as a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. He is currently the Director of Research, Department of Surgery at Dalhousie University and Orthopedic Outcomes Scientist at the Nova Scotia Health Authority in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction. I do appreciate it. And thanks, Warren, for organizing this night. It's been challenging with COVID to get this going. We've had many fits and starts, but we're here, so I appreciate it. Also like to take the opportunity to thank the Carleton for having us. I'll thank Susan Mullins, the president and CEO of the foundation, for all their hard work. Bruce Taller's here, who's also leading the campaign for the orthopedic robot. And in the back is Brittany McKinnon. I just want to give a shout out to her from NSH, who's moved mountains to help us proceed with our robotic endeavors here at Dalhousie and Nova Scotia Health, and here in Nova Scotia in general. So where to begin? So first of all, you heard about the QE2 Foundation Chair, and I would just like to express my gratitude and appreciation for the foundation for allowing that to happen. This is Candy Palmer, who wouldn't mind me telling you, it's public, she's a patient of mine. And I'm a big fan of hers. And she was our guest speaker at the foundation launch for the chair. And the chair has allowed us to do some pretty incredible things in terms of outcomes research. And I'm hopeful, it's not through me, it's through the team that's around me. I'm just the scalpel bit, the sharp end of the team that's allowed some really great things to happen with respect to outcomes and understanding of where we're going. So I'll preface this talk, and I've given talks like this on different occasions, obviously to more technically surgical audience, and I appreciate this talk because it gives me a chance to kind of refocus and recalibrate. And I hope I hit it where you need it to be, and I hope you find it interesting. There's a couple of surgical things at the end. Hopefully you'll be through your main courses by then. They're not too graphic, but they're, you're probably here to see a bit of a high diving act, so I'll show you one. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding of why we're so excited about the work that's happening with respect to robotics. But I'm going to use two touchstones, and basically I'm going to use two curves to kind of base my talk tonight. And the first is the asymptote utopia. This is what my supervisor taught me in Sweden, Leif Rid. He talked about Plato's Republic and how Plato talked about we're heading towards utopia, but we can never get there, hence an asymptote. And when I reflect on this, when I think about where we've been with knee replacement surgery, you can go to this relatively rapid phase of introduction where we went from a very small device that was placed. It was called the Macintosh spacer in the 1950s, and it was a flat piece of metal, almost square in nature. Cut was made in your knee, it was shoved in and said, there you go, enjoy that. And then someone came along and said, well, the knee's kind of round, bozos. And this guy was named Gunst. He was actually at Winnipeg, and he made it in his garage up until the 1980s. That was a little rail of a thing. And then someone said, well, the knee kind of looks more like this. And they made it wider and put two of them together and bridged it. And that was a duocondylar in the 70s. In 1984, John Insull made what's called the tricondylar knee. And my point is that if I was to show you that knee replacement with a modern knee replacement today, most of you probably couldn't tell the difference of what the modern one is. And so we've gone through our rapid phase on the asymptote of evolution, and now we're in phase 2, which brings new challenges and new paradigms in terms of how we move forward, because the innovation is not so much in the implant anymore. We've done that. It's in other aspects of our care. The second curve I want to base my talk on is the bell curve, which we're all aware of from grade school. And we all probably, at least I was introduced to this, we took everybody in the class and we lined them up and we measured them and we graphed them on a curve. And the point is that the entire human condition, for almost any variable you want to take, falls on a bell curve, a normal distribution. And what I'm going to go to for most of this talk is the concept of alignment, meaning how should we line you up when we put a knee replacement inside of you. And what my premise is that although we're on a bell curve, for the most part, until recently, we've ignored the outliers of the curve and we've just treated to an average. And I think that, personally, if I was to get to a philosophical approach, I think that's the renaissance in surgery and perhaps all of medicine, is that we're about to explode into a foray of personalized medicine, where we can recognize you as an individual and start to do something about it. So with that in mind, I need to take a few moments to talk a little bit about technical nature, and there won't be any much more technical than this, and all of you will understand this because it's simple, straightforward. And this is how we have thought about alignment of the leg. There's lots of engineers in the room, so I'm sure you'll hopefully like this. And what we've talked about is very simplistic angles, and you have to remember we've done a lot of our surgery. It's been an art. It's been a surgical art. And you do it with your eye, and you train people at your side like a guild. And that's what's changing. But to get us here, we've had to take the concept of what we call the mechanical axis. So in the case of the femur, if you draw the line from the center of your femoral head to the center of your knee, that's the mechanical axis. And the same thing with the tibia. If you drop a line from the center of your tibia to the center of your ankle, that's the tibial mechanical axis. So just keep those in mind for the next few slides. These get a little bit more wordy, but they're very simple concepts. At the end of that line, you form an angle for how your femur hits the ground, and that's called the lateral distal femoral angle. And I'm only going to show you that because I'm going to reference a slide that makes point of that. We call that the LDFA. And at the top of the tibia, you have a line that makes your medial proximal tibial angle. So proximal is close, medial is the inside. So it's not that hard, it's just Latin words. Tibial angles. And when you put that all together, you end up with what's called the hip-knee ankle angle. So that's a line from the center of the hip all the way down to the floor. All right? And what we like to think of, because we're kind of engineering based, we're fairly linear thinkers as orthopedic surgeons, we're selected to be so. We like to think of things as straight lines and make things straight, because it's easier to do with your eye to line things up in straight lines. So what we do is we aim, when we do most surgery, we say that despite the fact that we have a lot of variability, you just have to look around at people walking, we're going to go for a straight angle, the HKA, the hip-knee ankle angle. We're going to make it 0. We're going to make everybody at 90 on their MPTA, 90 on their LDFA, because it's really easy to cut right angles to perpendiculars. That's the truth. When you're using your hand and jigs, it's much easier to say I'm going to be parallel to the floor as opposed to say I'm going to put in 4.5 degrees. That's really hard to do with your eye. And so we've developed a whole series of jigs to do that. And what we do is, if you're following the plot, the axis of the femur anatomy is different than that mechanical axis. So we put a rod up the femur, and then we put a jig on the end of that, and then you cut through these jigs. And it becomes a little bit like paint by numbers once you do that. And the same thing with the tibia. We line up mechanical rods and literally stand back at the end of the table and line them up and say, this is where I want to cut. That's how I want to do your surgery. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way knee surgery has been done for a long time, and it works. It's been a highly successful procedure, both hip and knee replacement surgery. But I'll get to why it's coming has its limits. Now, all of this is planned off a two-dimensional X-ray and mostly a short leg film where we're not taking into account that overall length. And you know what you can tell from this film is that this is Röntgen was the first individual to take an X-ray, and it was in 1985. So this is a 130-year-old technology now. And this, in fact, was the first X-ray ever taken. It's his wife's hand. And when she saw it, she screamed and said, "I've seen my death," and she ran out. And I imagine it was a difficult dinner conversation after that. But my point with this is that this technology is almost essentially the same as what we're using today. It's changed little in what we do in terms of how we take an X-ray. So all of knee replacement surgery around the world, for the most part, at least until very recently, has been based off this 130-year-old two-dimensional technology. And that's key to understand, that it's two-dimensional, almost always just taken in the frontal plane. Sometimes in the side plane, we take advantage of that film, but really don't do a lot with it. Now, again, I want to be careful because we are standing on the shoulders of the giants who brought us here. This is a remarkable procedure. When people who trained me first started this, like Professor Yabsley, Reg Yabsley, and David Petrie, who started the program here in Halifax, they literally were using chisels in their eye to cut things, and they were freehanding it like you would sculpt a piece of stone. And you can imagine the skill that was required to pull that off and to teach that to others. And they took that art and they made it methodological, repeatable by producing jigs and other devices and techniques to get us to where we are. So I'm not trying to dump on that. That's not the point. But the point is we've kind of come to a plateau, the top part of that curve, and we need to go further. So going back to that bell curve, my fundamental premise is that we've ignored the individual variation. We're treating to an average, and we're treating to an average at our peril. And that's been the hang-up of where we've been limited to breaking through the top part of the curve in part. It's no longer about the prosthesis, it's about where you put the prosthesis on the bone and how you celebrate the individual variation. So you heard I was very fortunate to do my PhD work in Sweden. The very first paper I wrote was in 1997. We looked at every living patient in the country who had a knee replacement. We sent them a questionnaire. 95% of them answered. There's no country in the world that's like that. They sent us drawings, invited us to tea. They did all kinds of things. And what we found out is when we asked them critically, are you satisfied with the procedure, it was about 1 in 5 weren't satisfied. The study was subsequently duplicated in Wales, the same methodology on 10,000 patients, and was the exact same number, and we reproduced the study in Canada, up in Ontario in a subset, and it was the exact same number. So there's sort of a glass ceiling with respect to satisfaction after the procedure. And if you were to think about the fact that we're all obviously different, but we're getting the same standardized approach, you can understand why, if you're on a tail of that distribution, you might be dissatisfied with this average approach. And the other thing is that, a little bit technical, but if you look at survivorship over the year the implant's placed, we've really made no progress from 2003 to 2013, a more recent uptake on this. And it would be the same for 2021. We've sort of stalled with respect to our improvement of survivorship, so how long this device lasts in your body. We haven't made a lot of progress. You could almost argue we went backwards because we're operating on younger people and heavier people and things like that used to be restricted from the surgery. And so the joke is, this is not my waiting room, but this is close to what your waiting room looks like. This is the U.S. Olympic team. I think this is one of the most fascinating photos out there because if you look at this is the celebration of life. This is who we are as Homo sapiens. And this is the challenge as a surgeon. This is why it's fun to be a surgeon at the end of the day. Because you have to take your standardized approach and then you have to apply it the best you can. And this is the challenge, is that we have to match this cohort. Despite the fact that, clearly these individuals, or all of us in this room, are individual, and we should celebrate that. And you can just see it on that picture. It's so obvious. And so to say one size fits all, one approach fits all, clearly has kind of run out of steam when you think about this is what we're up against. I'll just mention a paper that is interesting. One of my fellows is here from Montreal who's worked with Pascal Vendatoli, a good friend of mine, who has done some really great research looking at these concepts of taking a whole bunch of his patients, looking at those angles, and this is what he found. So remember that HKA, how you're lined up from your hip to your ankle? Does this look familiar? Of course, as I referenced, it's a bell curve. So go figure, we fall in a normal distribution in terms of this angle, despite the fact that we're all getting the same angle at the time of surgery for the most part. So some people are bow-legged, some people are really bow-legged, some people are knock-kneed, some people happen to be straight. And it gets more interesting when you look at those LDFAs and MPTAs. Remember the angle that the tibia makes and the distal femur makes? They're also basically, guess what, on bell curves. And as I've told you, we kind of ignore that variability, although it's staring us in the face and it's so clearly obvious that it's there. And it gets more interesting still for us because these are two-dimensional images and we're still looking in the frontal plane, so if we're just looking at you from the front. But clearly this is a three-dimensional issue. We're not cutouts. We don't live in flat land and float around on a table. We're in a two-dimensional universe. We won't get into what dimensionality of the universe is, but clearly we're three-dimensional beings for the most part. And what's very clear from literature that's out there is that we come in shapes, and we have different kinds of shapes, and these shapes fall into patterns three-dimensionally. They're morphological variants, and you just have to, from the back of the room, it's very obvious when you look at this. And the question is, what do you do about these shapes? How do you approach them? How do you impute them into your surgical plan? So to kind of wrap up this bit of the talk, two-dimensional alignment in the frontal plane, where we just look at how you appear standing as we look at you front on, is really an oversimplification of the problem. And what we're really trying to do is we're looking at a three-dimensional platform that's based off morphology. If you really want to get into it, and this isn't for the talk tonight, but what gets really interesting, it's actually a four-dimensional problem because you have to walk through time and space. Nobody I know gets a knee replacement and goes around like that for the rest of their life, right? They have to do audacious things like climb stairs and get in and out of chairs and things like that. So the question is there a patient-specific target? Meaning, can I come up with a surgical plan that says you as an individual are like this, this is therefore what I would do specifically for you in your approach. And that's when we get into robotics. So there's only one approved robot really in Canada right now. Almost every company is starting to come out with a robot. I don't care about the company per se. What I care about is that they're the leading technology right now. And like Apple, they saw ahead, they acquired this technology. What they did importantly is they ring-fenced the technology around this, so they ring-fenced the IP. So they have a large head start on being ahead. So they took a large risk, developed the technology, and now they have such a large lead that it's going to be hard for people to catch up, at least in the next few years. So this is the game in town. And it's Mako Robotics, and I'm very proud to say, thanks to the foundation, the work that the team has done, we have one of these in Halifax now. Glenn Richards and myself and the fellows were there. We certified on Saturday, so we're now actually ready to go as Mako surgeons. And what it consists of is a robotic arm with haptic control, meaning that once we set boundary conditions, it will only go within that boundary condition. So a little bit like if you're shooting free throws and you put rails on the net, you can't go outside the rails. So once you decide where you want it, it's going to go there. It has 3 applications, and I'll touch on 2 of them. It has partial knee replacement, total knee replacement, and hip replacement, and you set it up with some cameras using stereoscopic vision and some basic feedback through GUIs on computer screens. All right, so here's a little example of what we start to see. So remember, we're no longer talking two-dimensional anymore. We're now talking three-dimensional because we have a CT scan. And so the patient is now getting a three-dimensional image before surgery. And before we even get to the OR, we can start to now take the implant, look at the planes of our cuts, and look at where the implant's going to sit on the bone in multiple dimensions and multiple planes. At the time of surgery, then, we place tracker arrays on, this is on a cadaver, so it's not too graphic, but I hope. Maybe that's worse. Sorry, I don't know. Yeah, I'm sorry. So these arrays are placed on the bone rigidly, so they're basically pinned to the bone, okay? And they're very analogous to Wii's, okay? So they're now optical trackers to the camera. And then we register the bone to the CT scan. So we have these cardinal points, and because these points are fixed, the computer then from then on knows exactly three-dimensionally where that bone is and what its relationship is to the screen and the cameras. So remember, this has completely changed what we've done. And then what we're able to do once we've registered the bone is we can virtually place the components before we've done any cuts, and we can see how those components fit on the bone, where they sit three-dimensionally in multiple planes. So completely changed our two-dimensional frontal plane view. And we can look at balance of the knee in terms of how your ligaments work. It gets a little technical, but it gets pretty straightforward from there. It's really not that much more difficult than your Wii in some circumstances, some respects. And then what happens is that, in this case, once you lock in the surgical plan, the surgeon guides the burr, but as I told you, you can't go outside this haptic boundary. So we've decided where to cut, and then you just kind of guide it as it cuts through that pathway. And there's only one place it's going to cut, and you can't go outside of it. So you can't get into tissue, you can't get into the artery. It's harder to make mistakes. And then you prepare the bone both on the femoral side and the tibial side. It shows you the green that you have to take away. And it's just really revolutionary in how you think about the surgery. And the same thing for the tibia. It guides you. Because we're using burrs and because we have haptic boundaries, meaning we can't go outside the bone because the computer knows where the end of the bone is. It shuts off when you get to the end of the bone. You can do things through much smaller incisions as a result. And at the end of that, you're then able to put in your trials and your definitive components, and this is the little bit of the carpentry stuff that we do. And then the metal bits go on, and then you range the knee, and then you can assess how the surgery went based off of the work that you've done. So you can check it out then and see, did I meet my plan? Is it working? Is it accurate? So confidence interval, the art, the difference between an art and a science really is the confidence interval, and the confidence interval goes from here to here in terms of reproducibility. So then the question becomes, where do we put it? I won't belabor this too much. It's the same thing with total knee replacement. And again, if you look, we now can see the knee in 3 dimensions. We can see it from the femur this way. We can see the top of the femur in the frontal plane. We can see the sagittal plane. I like this the best. As we scroll through, we can see all aspects of the 3-dimensional plane of where we're going to put the component. We can see if it's overhanging off your bone, how it fits you. It'd be kind of like fitting a pair of shoes on you. We know exactly where your bunion would be, and is the sole going to, your toe going to rub. All this is known before we start anything. And we can 3-dimensionally move the component around. We can change the sizes, and this is using the CAD model of the implant itself. So we can see exactly where it's going to fit and what consequence any of these changes has. We were debating this before we went, but if we were talking about the fact that there's 3 joints and there's 6 degrees of freedom and there's good and bad and, so. There's probably, for sake of argument, 380 million combinations in which we can place this knee on, but there's probably one right way to put it. And you can't even begin to process that as a human brain without the back end of the robot and the computer that's going on. So same thing, you go and you look at your gap balancing. Again, I won't belabor this, but you can check out how it's running. Is it balanced? And then with the total knee, you use a saw. And again, here's the haptic boundary. So we have a glide path, just like landing a plane, where the robot has to go. So the surgeon's job is to get it in that plane. And then it will not cut outside this boundary condition. Right? So the artery is right here, so you don't want to go back here. And you just kind of do Pac-Man here. You kind of make it go until the green disappears. It's very rewarding, waka, waka, waka kind of thing. All right. All right, so that's all the surgical bits. No more graphic pictures. So let's get into the last end of this, and I'll wrap up. So this is, to me, the more interesting bit in some ways is the epistemology. So a little background, personal background. My father was an aviator. He was a military aviator, and then he went to commercial aviation. He was a chief pilot, so he trained pilots. That's what he did for his living. And so I've grown up in a culture of aviation and a culture of safety around aviation. This is one of my favorite papers I wrote with a team in the States, where we looked at the concept of craft surgery and how evolution beyond craft surgery is both necessary and inevitable. And aviation has gone through these 5 steps from craft flying, where you used to have barnstormers and you wanted a Top Gun person to get you out of the dogfight. But then aviation progressed so fast from piston engines to jet engines that the reaction time became so quick that no pilot could process it. And they had to go to instruments and standardized procedures, finally by automation, and then, as you know, fully computer integrated flying. And this is the last person you want flying your plane now is a Top Gun hotshot. You want a highly methodical, check-based driven, standardized person in the control of that aircraft for safety reasons. And it's not a coincidence that in medicine and surgery we're following very closely behind aviation in terms of its culture of safety. We do surgical checklists, we're doing simulation, we're doing maintenance competence, which has been shown to us by aviation. They've been doing this for 50 to 60 years now. And the reason this is important, because if you look at miles flown to deaths, there's been a 1,000,000-fold reduction in aviation over since the, whatever that is, the 40s, in terms of miles flown per death per mile flown. The closest we have in a parallel analogy in medicine would be a 30-fold reduction in neonatal care. So they're talking a 1,000,000-fold reduction. We're at a 30-fold reduction in medicine. And in fact, there's the airlines up there. When you look at a graph of productivity and efficiency to quality, they excel at quality with pretty good efficiency. Health services here is lagging behind the U.S. Postal Services in terms of that metric, right? Yeah, I feel the same way. But so we're rife for change. We're rife for automation. We're rife for introduction of new technologies. So when I reflect on it, perhaps not that dissimilar from where my father and his colleagues were 50, 60 years ago, saying there's no way a computer's flying my plane. There's no pilot in the world now who can take off their aircraft, despite commercial aircraft, despite the fact they spent thousands of hours up in the bush flying at their own peril. They can clearly fly the aircraft, but if the computers aren't working, they're not taking off. Why? Because margin of error goes up and safety goes down. And so arrogance can't get in the way, saying you're not going to proceed without that tool that can change your outcome and reduce your confidence interval. So where I see it, and I don't see this as apocalyptic at all, but it does cause consternation for some conversations we have, is this is coming. And the future of surgery is going to be less and less about the mechanical bits. It's going to be more and more about the planning and the input. So just like the pilot imputes the flight plan, puts in the variables that are necessary, and then sits back and manages the computer while they execute the flight plan. That'll be very similar to what we'll do as surgeons in the future. We will input the variables that are important. That's where the four-dimensional bit gets interesting, because we're just starting into that field. But we'll have to understand a whole bunch of stuff about your collagen type, how you react to cement, a whole bunch of different variables, and then impute that into the surgical plan. So Calvin said, many of you have heard this quote, if you know nothing about what you're speaking, if you can't express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. So you have to know, that's basically, if you can't measure it, you can't change it. That's where that quote comes from. And so that, that reminds me back to the aviation, the black box that's there that records every event of the surgery. What we now have at the time of knee and hip replacement with the robot is we have every move we made at the time of surgery is now databased in a log file. And that's where the next iteration gets really excited, and why we're really excited to have a robot here, because it's not just the robot and what we can do to help patients, it's what we can do for research and innovation on the back end once we start to understand. When I did this to this patient, what outcome did I get? And that's where that chair scientist comes in, and the foundation funding that we have, because we can now close the loop. Because we now have a tool to say, well, if I put the component precisely here, what did I get? And there's few centers, frankly, if I may take a moment to be perhaps a bit immodest, that have the tools in place through funding we've had through Atlantic Innovation Fund, Canadian Institute of Health Research, et cetera. The suite of tools we have here and at Dalhousie to study this are world class. And then the most important bit is the students that come with that. They're the ones who really make this happen. And so if you were to sit there and say, look, we're done with surgery and this is as far as we go, you're not paying attention. And this is, of course, Moore's Law, which is, computational power doubles every 18 months and price drops in half. And it's debatable whether we're staying on this curve, but if you follow the curve, it's been remarkably consistent, and by 2045, we're going to have computational power equivalent to every brain on the planet. The question is, what are we going to do with that? And hopefully we can do things better than Candy Crush and Angry Birds and stuff like that, right? And so there's this explosion of artificial intelligence, and so this is obviously the next thing that's coming, and it's exploding faster than Moore's Law. In fact, it's going 50 times the speed of Moore's Law. So everybody says Moore's Law is stalled, but just hang on, boys and girls, like it's coming. It's going to knock your socks off, what's happening with respect to artificial intelligence and the processing power. And this is a good example, for example, of where we've been with Moore's Law. It's doubling and now it's gone in the last period of time, it's just gone up tenfold, right? And so it's just continuing to explode. So where we need to be is in a position to feed our computer science students and others this data that we're pulling out of the robot, this three-dimensional envelope of data with all the precise moves that are happening, et cetera, which is, again, why I kind of get really excited, not just the surgical aspect, but what the next tranche will be, what we can bring to this community via this level of research and understanding. So, for example, this is a group called iMorphics out of Manchester, United Kingdom, who Stryker acquired the group who provides the Mako robot, and this is based on 10,000 CT scans that they had. And what they're able to do is take your arthritic knee and augmented reality based, run it backwards in time to say that this is what you looked like 20 years ago. So imagine the power of that now. We've gone from a two-dimensional 130-year-old technology to maybe some technology where we can take CAT scans, this is what you looked like when you're 18. So this is the target that I should be aiming for as opposed to this disease target. And that's really powerful stuff you can do. I'm going to end with this. I'm almost done. Thank you for your patience. So two really interesting philosophers I've been reading a little about recently. This is Gaston Bachelard. He was a Parisian philosopher. And he talked about the concept of an epistemological obstacle. Epistemology, of course, being the philosophy of how we know what we know, or that realm. And he talked about the fact that we're replete with obstacles and we have mind traps where we can't proceed. And a more interesting fellow is Michel Foucault, who was also a Parisian philosopher studying under Bachelard. He was the first prominent Parisian to die of HIV complications. And when he was younger, he was institutionalized for being homosexual. And you can imagine that really kind of pissed him off. And it made him think a lot about how medicine is particularly replete with these epistemological obstacles. And he talked about the concept of an epistemological rupture, meaning that just suddenly you go along with the same paradigm and then it changes overnight. And what I would tell you strongly from my strong belief is that we're on the verge of epistemological rupture when it comes to this alignment, how we place your components, how robotics intersects and becomes introduced to what we do as surgeons. So personalized medicine is here, healthcare is here. If we don't pay attention, we're going to get totally wiped out. This is what patients want. This is what patients demand. This is what I want, right? Like, why would I want an average approach? We all like being special. We all are special. And we should be in a position to celebrate that. So what's interesting, I told you about this evolution, we've gone from combining these components. What's happening next now through this knowledge base is we're actually going to de-evolve the component now, I think. And we're going to go to more intricate, smaller surgeries done with a robot to, instead of putting one homogeneous shape in, put several unique shapes in. And of course, we're now three-dimensionally printing titanium, so we can now print any shape you want. The question right now is just a matter of cost, but of course that will come down. So you will be able to have a custom knee made to you that fits you precisely, and a hip, and a spine implant, and a trauma implant, and all kinds of things are coming. It's not going away. So there's over 450,000 Mako cases done to date. We're actually a little bit late to the game. That's not a slag on anything. That's just a function of the Canadian healthcare system, because in a lot of jurisdictions, there's over 1,000 Makos placed. They're in every state of the United States, and they're in whatever that says down there. They're in a whole bunch of countries. And we're now the second in Canada. So that's a good thing. But we're a little bit behind, but we're about to leapfrog, I think, and jump over people because of this research arm that we have in place to add into what's happening. So I started with this curve, and I'll end with this curve. The asymptote utopia, I've been at the glass ceiling. It's obvious with the printing, with the design, the three-dimensional power, the computational power, the artificial intelligence. We're about to break through. And I'm really grateful for the support of the foundation to be sitting on that precipice to break through the glass ceiling. Thank you for your attention. Do you want me to sit, or do you want me to take some questions? Can I go eat my beef carpaccio?
So what we'll do is there's people who are posting Slido questions right now, so we'll do a question period after the second talk.
Perfect.
So for now, we'll take about a 10-minute break, and then Dave Shea's going to give a talk. That was awesome, man. Thanks.
Please, Nate, tell me there's no horse.
No, not that I know of.
December finally came. We're almost back to the start. Come, baby, now this is where we decide to sure. He turned just like you, he flew away. And the melody remained just like you, he filled the day.
If I could only fly, if I could build a bridge, I'd carry you, my love, across this barren ridge. If there were just some way, I'd pull a carriage through the snow, take you over Kelly's Mountain to the village there below, and no one would ever know. Oh, the snow was high again in the year of 1910 when I rode over Kelly's Top from Lake Bredor. O'er the mountain I had come without rapier, without gun, to fetch my father's order from the St. Anne store. As I purchased my supplies, a pretty maiden caught my eye. Her beauty shone upon me like the sun. As my heart melted away, I heard somebody say, that is the daughter fair of you, McGowan. Well, she knew she caught my eye, and she smiled as she walked by, saying, meet me when the stars come out tonight. On the high road I will wait by old Don Campbell's gate, and we'll sing a song of love there in the moonlight. If I could only fly, if I could build a bridge, I'd carry you, my love, across this barren ridge. If there were just some way, I'd pull a carriage through the snow, take you over Kelly's Mountain to the village there below, and no one would ever know. I knew McGowan was a man with a very heavy hand, and his daughter was the meaning to his life. All her suitors, they had come to the wrong end of his gun. As long as he was living, she'd be no man's wife. But I met her 'neath the stars, and I took her in my arms, and she said, please take me with you when you go. Beneath my father's cruel hand, no longer I can stand. I'll leave with you and he will never know. If I could only fly, if I could build a bridge, I'd carry you, my love, across that barren ridge. If there were just some way, I'd pull a carriage through the snow, take you over Kelly's Mountain to the village there below, and no one would ever know. Hill when a gunshot broke the still, and I felt the pain burn deep within my side. She said, my God, we have to run. My father has a gun, and he'll never let you take me as your bride. In my pain I slipped and fell, and it wasn't hard to tell that McGowan cursed my soul not far behind. I pulled her sobbing to my breast, saying, here I've come to rest, but there's something that I wish before I'm dying. You can only fly.
So I'm going to introduce our last speaker for the evening. After we're done this talk, we'll take another little break, and we're noticing a lot of the Slido questions coming in, so that's awesome. Keep them coming. And we'll set up and we'll have a little question period. But right now, I had the pleasure to introduce my friend Dave Shea. Dave's a Senior VP of Engineering for Kraken Robotics. Dave Shea is a Senior VP for Engineering at Kraken Robotics, based in Mount Pearl, Newfoundland. He's been managing the design, production, and operation of underwater robotics in the United States and Canada for over 13 years. He has led field teams on sea trials all over the world and was deploying Kraken sonar technologies for the discovery of HMS Erebus from the 2014 Franklin expedition and the Raise the Arrow expedition in 2017. So anybody knows about the Avro Arrow and the whole myth within Canada, which resulted actually in the discovery of 2 of the 9 Avro Arrow models. Previously, he was engineering manager at Marine Robotics, as well as being the lead design engineer for the SQX 500 autonomous underwater vehicle. Dave holds a BEng in electrical engineering from the University of Victoria and is a registered professional engineer in Newfoundland. So please join me in welcoming Dave Shea.
Thanks, Warren, for that great introduction, and thanks, Dr. Dunbar, for doing a fantastic job before me. I think I'm going to leverage a lot of that stuff. You've explained computers and robotics and all that, so now everybody knows what I'm going to be talking about. So when Warren first reached out to me and talked to me about this event, and of course we've rescheduled a few times with COVID, he said, "Oh well, I really want to get everybody together and try and do this brief the general public, spread some knowledge, and get everybody up to speed on robots." I said, "Well, you want me to come and talk about robots and drink beer? That is my perfect Tuesday night, 100%. So I'm very thankful to be able to be here, thankful to do it for a good cause for the QE2. Just remind everybody, there's that wonderful little QR code on your tables there. Use that to donate here. So as Warren mentioned, I've been involved in underwater robotics for a long time. I've been in underwater robots for 15 years, and well, much longer if you count some of the Lego stuff I was doing back in the early days. I originally got involved in underwater robotics when I was doing my undergrad in British Columbia. I'm from BC originally. I had a couple of buddies who were working on this extracurricular student project. They were building this underwater robot. And they came to me and they said, "Oh, we're looking for another pair of hands. Can you help us solder some circuit boards? Can you help us build this robot?" Being the stereotypically overly confident engineer I was, I looked at what they were doing and I said, how hard could that possibly be? I spent an enormous amount of time, nights, weekends, working on this robot, and luckily it led to a career in underwater robotics. It's taken me all over the world. It's taken me to the Arctic. It's taken me on the Avro Arrow expedition. It's taken me from one side of the country to the other, and it's brought me here tonight. So I'm very thankful to be able to be involved in that. Particularly with Kraken Robotics, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do and how we do that. We started Kraken about 9 years ago in 2012 in St. John's, Newfoundland, with 6 people. Today, we're in 3 provinces, as well as here in Nova Scotia, in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. We're in 6 countries. We're over 200 people worldwide. We've grown massively in the past few years. We're exporting our products all over the world. And all those great things, all that great growth has really taught me one thing. It's really hard. But it's really important. And it's really, really worthwhile to be able to do what we're doing here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Kraken Robotics. I'm going to put up some really pretty pictures, so I'm not going to test anybody at the end, but I'm happy to take any more detailed questions. So for those of you who don't know Kraken, we're really experts in maritime technology, marine robotics technology. We do a lot of modeling and simulation. We do FEA. We do a lot of CAD designs. We develop our own artificial intelligence. Dr. Dunbar did a great job alluding to some of that stuff. So all of the systems that we're building in-house to control our robots. We build our own sensors. We build our own sonar systems, our own laser scanners. We build our own batteries, our own thrusters. And all those bits and pieces really get combined together into the underwater platforms that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So before I get too far into the details, I really want to talk about why it matters, why underwater robotics are so important. Well, it's going to be a stereotypical number, but as everyone I think has heard in the past, 70% of our world is covered in ocean. 70% of the planet is water. Of that 70% of all of those oceans we have, the gross majority of it is unmapped, unexplored, unsurveyed. So what that means is the most of our planet hasn't been explored. And the question is why? Well, generally, when we're looking at what's out there and we're looking at the water, we're looking at the ocean, we look at our history as human beings, our knowledge of the ocean tends to stop right about here. Human beings are bad at exploring the water. We have to hold our breath. We can only go up to that certain depth. We are very good at exploring the air. We're exploring space. One of the questions we always face is, why do we know so much about the moon? Why have we mapped the surface of Mars and areas of Jupiter before we've ever done any of that here in our own oceans? The fundamental challenge there is physics. The telescopes, the radars, the communication systems that we're using in those environments, they just don't work underwater. Radio frequencies don't work. We have no GPS. Not only that, but the ocean is one of the most challenging environments on this planet or any other. This is one of our systems out at sea on our test vessel. This is outside of Halifax Harbor. Miserable day for the people on board, but the robot doesn't care. So the ocean, seawater is fundamentally corrosive. It's electrically conductive. As I mentioned, radio frequencies don't work. GPS doesn't work. It's the hardest area to work in anywhere else in the world. We've been watching people launching rockets into space and bringing them back down. We've been watching live streaming landing on the surface of Mars 400 million kilometers away, and yet we don't have that kind of capability and that kind of technology for our oceans. So one of the questions is, why do we want to be there? What do we want these robots to be doing? How do we want them to be working? Well, something we say a lot in underwater robotics is dull, dirty, and dangerous. So why do we want to be putting robots out in this environment? Well, one, it's dangerous. It's miserable out there. It's tough. We don't want to be putting people in those environments. We have tasks like hydrographic mapping, seafloor mapping, where we want to be putting out multiple robotics. We want to be surveying large areas of the seabed. Marine habitat monitoring, we have in Canada, for example, up to 30% of our oceans are going to be claimed as marine protected areas by 2030. We need these robotic systems to be able to go out there and survey and protect. Infrastructure monitoring and intervention. Those of you who are familiar with the Deepwater Horizon disaster a number of years ago, off of the Gulf of Mexico, we had a blowout. It took an ROV in 1,600 meters of water. We had to put a robot down there to be able to put those caps on those wells to seal those valves. Mineral exploration is becoming a very hot topic these days, looking around for these nodules on the seabed, manganese nodules. Search and recovery, when we're looking for objects on the seafloor, whether it's planes falling out of the sky, whether there's disasters with vessels. And the main application that we're really heavily involved in is mine hunting. So looking for seabed explosive mines. So when I talk about mines and I talk about the defense industry, myself and Warren are very heavily involved in this area, and a number of the folks in the audience. People may not be aware, but sea mines do still exist. And they aren't the big spiky balls that we're all aware of that we've seen in the Hunt for Red October and things like that. Today we're seeing objects that are being designed to look like rocks, designed to sound like rocks, designed to sit there and wait for long periods of time. These are stealthy, they're challenging, and they're out there everywhere. So these are the areas that we need to be deploying these robotic systems. These are the areas where we want to be operating our vehicles to be able to map the seafloor, to be able to find these objects and to be able to hopefully dispose of them in a way that's efficient and, more importantly, is safe to be able to get people out of that harm's way. So I'm going to dive a little bit into how it works and what we're doing, and specifically the different types of underwater robots that we're working with. So there's two general areas that we'll be talking about this evening. We have remotely operated vehicles. These are tethered underwater vehicles. They're human operated, so you've got a person there sitting on a ship, power and communications going down this cable. You put that robot down under the water. You can run it for as long as the humans can be there or as long as the ship can stay in space. Essentially, they can be operated indefinitely. One of the challenges you have there is you need a person for every robot that you have in the water. It requires human beings to control and operate these systems, and therefore it is fundamentally fallible. From hour 1 of someone's shift to hour 10 of that shift, you're going to get a different result. The other types of systems that we're really working on and we're pushing forward in this industry is autonomous underwater vehicles. So these are battery-powered autonomous systems. They can be deployed off of a surface vessel. They can be deployed from a ship. They're designed to swim down to the seafloor, to conduct a mission, to survey for a target, whether it's a mine, an object, looking for leaks in a pipeline, looking for a cable. One of the most interesting parts of these systems, though, when you don't have that cable, when you don't have that communication, when you don't have a human being on the other end of that equation, it has to be artificially intelligent. So we have to be pushing down, and this is really where Dr. Dunbar did a fantastic job for me, the advancement of computing. So the only way that we're able to really achieve these capabilities is fundamentally based on computational processing. We are now pushing with machine learning and deep learning the capacity of a human being down into these vehicles. So it can make a decision by itself. It can decide if one of its thrusters stops working, what should it do? It can decide if I've detected something on the seafloor, should I come up to the surface and communicate back? Should I go over and inspect that and take a closer picture of that object? So the traditional autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, and many of you might have seen pictures of these before. They look like submarines. They act like submarines. They've got typical thrusters, control fins on the back. These systems are fairly commonplace in the industry. You put them in the water, they swim like a torpedo, they perform a mission. So the problem with these types of vehicles is they can't stay down for long periods of time, and they can't stop. They can't hover, they can't inspect an object. So they're able to be deployed and survey and collect this information, but we're not able to leave it there actually in residence underneath the water. Where we're seeing that industry shifting now, and where we've really been focusing a lot of our efforts at Kraken here in Nova Scotia and in Canada in general, is on that next generation of autonomous underwater vehicles. So these are vehicles that are designed not only to be deployed from a surface ship, but they're designed to live on the seafloor. So we actually put these systems down into an ocean environment, whether it's monitoring a harbor for security applications, whether it's monitoring an oil field. For example, many of you might have heard in Newfoundland a few years ago, we had a rather significant disaster. A Husky had an oil spill. They had a damage to one of their flow lines. One of the problems that they had in that environment was the weather was so bad, they weren't able to get a ship out to sea for 3 days. So they knew there was oil coming out, but they didn't know exactly where the problem was. One of the missions for these types of vehicles is to actually live out there in that oil field, to live in that environment, to be able to autonomously leave its docking station like you see here, to be able to swim out to the object, to the wellhead, to whatever it is it needs to look at, provide some data, provide some pictures, and then bring that back, either coming to the surface or coming back to its docking station, where it can happily recharge its batteries, happily download information, and then get ready for the next mission. This sounds really cool and really complicated, but the reality is that we're actually building these systems now. We're operating these systems. This is one of the vehicles that our research team had worked on in Germany previously. And when I talk about an autonomous vehicle, keep in mind, as I mentioned, there's no GPS, there's no communication with the vehicle. It has to identify that docking station. It has to decide how it's going to come in and attack that, how it's going to actually approach it to be able to navigate into that environment. When you talk about the landing systems on airplanes, when you're working in that environment, you have all of these communication systems, all of this navigation. You've got the radar, you've got the radio frequency. None of that works underwater. So the vehicle has to be using its cameras, it has to be using its sonars, it has to be making all of these decisions on board. And this is really where the future of maritime robotics is going. So this is really interesting technology, and it's cool, but when we're talking, this is an example in a swimming pool in Germany, in Bremen, where we're operating, down to where the vehicle is operating there. It's about 30 feet underwater. The pressure at 30 feet or 10 meters is about 14 psi. That's the same difference as between here and space, between here and a satellite system. The systems that we're building and the systems that we're deploying are going up to 6,000 meters depth. We're talking about 10,000 psi. The depth at the bottom of the Marianas Trench pressure is around 15,000 pounds per square inch. So that's on the order of 1,000 times more than what we're seeing in space, or that pressure difference. So the challenges there is not only do we have to have an autonomous system, does it need to be able to make these decisions on its own, it needs to be reliable. If a thruster breaks, if something goes wrong down there at those depths, it can't come to the surface. It can't come back and just swap out a part. It can't land and have somebody repair it. It has to be able to make those decisions all on its own. And that's really where we're pushing the envelope in all of this development. So it's all well and good to have a robot to put it in the water, to get it to swim down, to autonomously decide what mission it wants to do. But the real question is, what is it going to do when it gets down there? So when I mentioned Kraken in the background of what we've been doing, now our fundamental core was sensors and systems. That's where we got our start, cutting our teeth on something called synthetic aperture sonar. So this is a very high-resolution seabed imaging, seabed mapping sonar system. So one of the challenges that we have with underwater robots is to be able to go out and map with traditional sonar systems. The further away you are from an object with a traditional sonar system, the worse the resolution gets. Just the same way with a camera. We can't use a zoom lens the same way you would in air or if you're doing any type of photography. So we use something called synthetic aperture sonar. So we're able to combine all of these pings, combine all of the data from the sonar to make it look like it comes from a much, much longer or much larger sonar than what's physically on the vehicle itself. To the point where that vehicle that I showed you in that tank, it has a 1 meter long sonar system, a 1 meter array on it. It looks like it has a 25 meter long sonar on it because of this capability. So this is really key to be able to go out and collect all of this data. When the vehicles are down there, we want to be collecting the best information we can get all at the same time. We want to be able to survey once and repurpose that data as many times as we can when we're surveying for leaks in a pipeline or when we're surveying for objects on the seafloor. We're collecting both imagery and bathymetry. These are actually Volvos that are outside in Halifax Harbor. So there's about 25 of these down there, and this acoustic image on the left-hand side is a roughly 2 or 3 centimeter resolution. We can see the doors are open on these. We can see the roofs are collapsed. We can see the engines have been removed. But not only that, not only are we providing an acoustic image of what's out there in the environment and what we might be seeing on the seafloor, we're providing what's called a bathymetric map, or almost a topographical map. So we're measuring the height of objects on the seabed. So we're able to determine, for example, Halifax Harbor, when you're bringing ships in and out of that port, you want to know exactly what the depth below keel is, if there's any risk to any vessels. We want to know what's the biggest freighter that we can possibly bring into the harbor, and that really depends on what the depth is. So we want to be measuring all of that information, and all of this is being collected and processed on all of these robots in real time in this ocean environment. So it's really cool to have pictures, interesting pictures of what's out there on the seafloor and to be deploying these robots. But one of the questions we always get was, well, why do you need this high resolution? Why do I need a 2 centimeter resolution picture of a piece of junk on the seafloor there? So this is a project that we did with the Canadian Hydrographic Service a few years ago. There was an object that they found outside of Halifax Harbor. It's roughly in 45 meters of water, as you can see on the depth chart on the side. So they collected this image, and they came to us because they believed that this was the HMCS Esquimalt, which was the last Canadian warship sunk during the war, still out there somewhere. So they came to us and asked us, can we go out and look at this with their sonar system? One of the challenges they had is the sonar that they have mounted on the hull of those vessels, it's always going to be 45 meters away from the bottom. No matter how many times they go over and circle over top of that, their image is always going to end up looking like this. We took one of our underwater robots out there, and we were able to collect an image like this. So first of all, we're about an order of magnitude better resolution. The data that we're collecting there tells us definitely not a warship. Certainly doesn't look like a warship to us. But not only that are we able to collect this bathymetry while we're out there, we're able to collect that acoustic imagery. So we're able to step it down even further to that 2 centimeter backscatter or 2 centimeter acoustic imagery. So that tells us right away, absolutely not a warship. It's a barge. It's an 80-meter barge. It's an uncharted barge. There was no record of it anywhere that we had when we had spoken to some local folks about it. But at the end of the day, it was still a barge. So one of the motivations when we've been pushing this idea of robotics and sensing technologies out there is not to equip a vehicle with just the sonar you need for that particular mission. We're not putting only mine hunting sonars on only mine hunting vehicles. We're taking all of these fleets of vehicles for all these different applications, and we're equipping them with the same capability. So we can go out there and we can survey once, we can collect data once, and we can repurpose it many, many times. So if you're collecting a chart, for example, in Halifax Harbor, that resolution is perfectly fine. But if you find an object out there that, hey, maybe that wasn't there the last time you went and surveyed, we can take it all the way down to that resolution. And not only that, but the robot itself gets to see this type of information on board. So it can make its own decisions about what's out there in the environment. It can decide if I see an object, and this is where we get into the next images. If I see an object in that environment, what do I do with it? Do I need to decide to go over it and get a closer look? So this is actually some data from offshore Newfoundland. These are mooring chains which are attached to a floating platform, a big, large platform there. So there's 12 of these chains attached to the platform. We image this with the sonar system because we're doing what's called inspection, repair, and maintenance. So we're looking to see the mooring chains on the seafloor. They're supposed to be in a certain position. There's a berm here. Those mooring chains are contacting. There's a big concern where it contacts the seafloor because that can wear away on the chain. If the chain breaks loose, well, that causes more strain on the rest of the chains. If all those chains break loose, well, then we run the risk of a very large disaster, which is a big concern in this industry. So we deployed a robot out there, and this is in around 100 meters of water. So again, the robot can get right down close to the seafloor. It can swim along these chains. It can detect it and decide where it needs to fly to get the best image. So when we zoom in onto these chains, we can start to see the individual links, but even now we're approaching the limitation of the sonar. So even at that 2 centimeter, 3 centimeter resolution, it's still not good enough for us. So the robot decided that there's some piece of this that potentially there might be an issue. So it went back over, and this is where we start to equip these systems with multiple sensors. It's not just one tool for every job. Sometimes when your only tool is a hammer and every problem is a nail. So we have a sonar system on there, but we also have an optical laser. So it can actually get down right close to these chains. And when I mentioned the 2 or 3 centimeter acoustic data, we're able to provide a 0.9 millimeter optical resolution of the chain. Not only that, but what's happening on board the vehicle here is, the chain itself, the black and white background, the chain isn't naturally colored. It doesn't normally look like that. That colorization is artificial, and what we've done, and it's a little hard to see here in the PowerPoint, but we've created a difference model. So we built a model of the chain. We took that scan, that point cloud of the chain, and we subtracted them from one another. And that gave us this information that tells us we've colorized the depth relative to the model. So everything that you see in blue is actually corroded away or worn away from the chain. Everything that you see in red is actually above the diameter of the chain. So that's either biofouling, that's growth. It's a little hard to see here, but there's a sea star there, and there's a crab here that obviously shouldn't be there. So this not only provides us with a really high-resolution picture of what's happening down there, but it provides us with a quantitative assessment of what's going on. We can go back over that environment with that chain. We can do it 10 times a day. We can do it 10 times a month. We can do it every other year. And the robot will always provide us with the same data. So we can compare this time and time again and quantitatively map to say, well, this one particular chain is always wearing out faster than all the other ones. This one part of the sea floor, you're getting more sedimentation, meaning you're getting more accumulation of sediment in this particular area. So all of these capabilities are being built into these robots and being deployed out there into these fields. So that brings me to the final point, which is, well, why does it matter? Why does it matter to us? I mean, it matters to me because I like robots. That's my thing. It's really cool. But I think it matters more important than that. Why does it matter to us as Canadians? Why does it matter to us in Halifax? Fundamentally, we're an ocean nation. We are a country with the longest coastline in the world, 200,000 kilometers of coastline. We're bordered by 3 oceans. Over 20% of our trade is done by the ocean, by sea. Over 30% of our sea, as our territorial waters, are going to be marine protected areas. And yet, with all this significant coast and all these significant opportunities that we have here, less than 1% of our GDP in Canada comes from the ocean. That's compared to a world average of around 2.5%. The US is on the order of 2%. Norway, a country that's comparable in terms of the technologies that they're deploying, has over 25% of their GDP is coming out of the ocean and the ocean economy. So there's not just an interesting robotics opportunity here. There's not just a cool application of sensors and everything else. There's a fantastic opportunity, an economic opportunity for us here in Canada. Innovation is a fundamentally renewable resource. The types of technologies that are being developed here in Canada, here in Halifax, just 2 miles away from here, between DRDC, Kraken Robotics, many other companies across the country that are doing this type of work. There's a significant opportunity to not only develop and grow these capabilities here, but fundamentally export them around the world. Because those 3 oceans are not just our oceans. This is not just a Canadian opportunity. There's an opportunity to expand these technologies and export them around the world. So that was a crash course in what we're doing in underwater vehicles and underwater robotics, and I hope that you learned a little something about that, and I guess we'll get into questions next.
Thanks, bud.
Thanks.
Okay, folks, so we'll just take maybe 5 minutes, give us a chance to get all set up, and then we'll go through some of the Slido questions. Thanks very much. Well done, huh?
No, that one is actually off the coast of
Masterpiece. She's a masterpiece. She's a masterpiece. She's
Yeah, there is. Actually, there's quite a few. So once John's ready there, let's go. Hey, folks. Well, yeah. So as I mentioned before, we're going to try and do a bit of a. Well, ideally this would be a little more interactive, but everybody submitted questions over Slido. So we'll do a bit of a panel chat. I think one of the interesting things that will come out of this talk is for both Dave and Michael and myself, I guess, to chip in and have some of that chat. So a few of the early ones that popped up are definitely medicine related. So I'm going to start with one of the first questions is about your talk. When they were talking about doing the surgeries, is there a CT scan running?
No, so the CT scan is collected before the surgery, and it's then imported into the computer by what's called a Mako product specialist. So a technician takes that image and puts it in the computer, and then before the surgery, we then have the ability to work off that CT scan. And then as I briefly mentioned, at the time of surgery, the key is then to register the CT scan that's inside the computer to the fixed bone. We have a little bit of an advantage over the Da Vinci, for example, where they're working on kidneys and prostates and bladders and things, because we're working off of rigid structures, which are easier to image, and then also they don't change as much over time. So there's a window in which we have to collect the image because your skeleton really doesn't change much over a month, and it gives us a higher degree of fidelity because of that. So there's some major advantages of working off the skeleton.
So is there currently a way to set any of the calibration points of the Mako robot prior to the surgery beginning? So what's the hardest part of using this robot?
Well, yeah, there's definitely a way to do that. And certainly, I mean, we've all just, those of us who are just starting into it, we've actually have apps on our phone that we can do this on. So we can practice on the phone with test cases, and then
that's troubling, right?
yeah, I understand. We're a very, very boring group of people. And then certainly you can go off a desktop or another device, so you can go ahead and perform your surgery. It'd be not unlike practicing your flight plan on a simulator, and then practicing the landing, et cetera, right? And then where it gets interesting would be crossover with some of the underwater robotics work, et cetera. I mean, you can imagine a day where you're going to have augmented reality glasses on and be able to walk around inside the knee and do the surgery and visualize exactly what you're going to come across.
So Dave, this is a question that's definitely underwater robotics related. What kind of tracking is the system using that you were demonstrating in your talk?
So there's a few different tracking technologies that are used. Acoustic communications, ultra short baseline systems. So generally you've got an array of hydrophones or sensors, and you ping the vehicle, and the vehicle responds, and that allows you to triangulate its position. The systems that you saw on the docking station there, where we're actually docking autonomously between the vehicle and a subsea asset, use a couple of different things. We use an acoustic imaging sonar, so it's got a small forward-looking sonar, and it knows what the dock looks like in the sonar. So it's been programmed with a deep learning algorithm to recognize the dock. But once it gets very, very close, that doesn't work very well, because essentially your sonar, you're saturating the front end of it. So at that point, and you might not have seen it in the video, but we use these optical tags. So they're called April tags. So they look kind of like the QR codes that you see on your tables here. So that tells us where the robot is in orientation to the dock. So we use a combination of the acoustic systems and the optical systems for docking.
Can the robot make a donation if it scans the tag on the dock?
It certainly can if you program it
will
with your
next
credit
week.
card.
Good thinking. It's not, we don't work in two dissimilar environments. We're in a saline environment, corrosive, right? A lot of pressure. Hard to communicate sometimes because the music's loud. But there will come a day as well where these similar technologies will also be used at the OR to get around the CT, for example, LiDAR, other forms of light-emitting technologies to give us accurate three-dimensional representation at the time of surgery. Right? I mean, it's going to be phenomenal. Apple's coming out in the next year or so with their glasses. Google's just come out with a repeat set. They'll have LiDAR built into them just like it's on your phone right now. And there's already work underway where we could use that to scan the bone at the time of surgery, take the CAD model and then spin it around in your eye and superimpose it. So you could start to go to the next level very quickly. You could see it happening.
Well, you know, one of the things I always found kind of interesting with medicine is a lot of the work that we do with sonars is focused around what we would call perception, right? So it's training algorithms, and Dave sort of talked about this a little bit. It's training algorithms to take all that data and turn it into actionable information, right? And it's neat how you're starting to see some of those concepts transferring to ultrasound, transferring to CT scans, where a lot of that sort of classification of images is happening in an automated way, right? It's something in robotics that we're constantly dependent on, because the robot needs to be able to see and sense the world in order to do something about it, right? So seeing that move into surgery and hopefully be almost, I don't want to say better than a human, but more consistent than a human at doing that detection and classification of things like early cancer, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I think there's a lot of interesting parallels there when we talk about ultrasounds. For example, all the electronics that we're using in our sonar systems, like we talk about AUVs and sonars and things like that, the consumption, the drive towards that growth in computing and growth in electronics, there's not enough AUVs in the world to justify someone like Apple building a custom processor for it. It's all coming out of things like medical imaging. Like we use exactly the same chips in our sonar systems that are being used in medical ultrasounds.
What was interesting to me about the image I showed you of the knee basically melting and unmelting the arthritis is that was done by a company of postdocs looking at just computational imaging, machine learning, deep learning. None of them had any concept of what a knee was, let alone medicine. And it was probably that divorcing of preconceived ideas and notions that allowed them to break through and come up with these algorithms that could demonstrate the knee, because there would be so much bias otherwise. And perhaps it's not transparent or not, but there's a lot of big egos in medicine, right? Who say that, who would,
Big egos in science.
yeah, well, you know what I'm saying, who would say, no, that's not the way it's going to be, and that can never be the case. But, disruption is right around the corner for everything we do, and it often takes a fresh look to just shake it up and say, let's change the paradigm, which is why I particularly like Foucault, saying that the rupture is coming. So this is one of the reasons, if I may, I just throw out this other thing, is I really appreciate being surrounded by the students because they come in fresh and they don't have the baggage that I carry to the operation. And they often come up with brilliant, unconventional ideas. You just have to have an open ear to it. Chance favors a prepared mind, but there's lots of answers out there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point about being surrounded by students. I think Dave would probably say the same with young employees, and I know with young scientists when they come into the lab. It is refreshing because there's a different approach. There's a different level of trust. And it's the same thing with robotics, right? When we talk about robotics, one of the biggest challenges we have is trust. Trust in surgical robotics, trust in a robot telling you there's no mind there. And one of the things that I've found from working with people is that there is a younger generation that trusts robotics so much easier, right? That trusts technology so much easier.
That's fascinating. So this is a sociological issue. So if you go to Japan, there's robots everywhere. And that's part of a cultural issue where Shinto Buddhism puts animation in inanimate objects, so the fox is alive at the fox temple, etc. And it's probably not a surprise that they have now robots in the nursing homes to comfort elderly people. They have robots in bars dancing and mixing drinks, and they've embraced robots. We've sort of taken the HAL approach here a little bit, like, robots are going to get me and lock me out of the spaceship and things like that. So it's been a little bit of a slower adaptation, but it is coming, and it's partly to do with that trust. And you're precisely right, the generation that's coming, they're facile and used to this. There was an interesting study not long ago, laparoscopic surgery, for example. Surgeons who play video games can do it 30% faster and have half the error rate, right? So there's a whole generation coming that are just used to moving their fingers and thinking differently and multitasking. And it's going to be really refreshing to see what happens when they start to get their feet wet in what we're doing now.
So that actually kind of leads to an interesting question that was posted here. How could AI play a role in both fields? So orthopedics and underwater autonomous vehicles. I know I certainly have my opinions on that, but
I think AI in underwater robots, and with any type of robots, but underwater robots in particular, it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have. It's an absolute necessity to be able to deal with these systems. Historically, the torpedo-shaped vehicles I showed on the screen there, We call them autonomous, but they're not. They're essentially automated. They're scripted. They're following a set of instructions that says go here, spin your thruster this much, and then when you run this low on battery, come up. The artificial intelligence in those seabed resident systems, when you put something down on the seafloor for 12 months or 24 months, it needs to know if its thruster starts degrading and it starts spinning to one side, just in the same way if one of your tires is low on your car, it needs to be able to compensate for that, to be able to survive in those environments and make intelligent decisions, but also make predictable decisions. It's something where to be doing the types of activities we want them to be doing, we have to have AI embedded in those vehicles.
So I'm not an expert in AI, but I'm interested in it. And from what I've read, I think AI is particularly good at processing disparate streams of information quickly, giving real-time answers and providing generalizable answers that can be imputed and acted on. So where the first tranche of AI will come in was, what I showed about identifying what phenotype of cluster you're in or how you're different from another patient. But then the next will be the wearable sensors we're all increasingly getting comfortable with wearing. So your phone has a track cell accelerometer, which actually can do some pretty powerful stuff. The new, sorry to go back to the Apple, but they have a falls risk program and built into the iPhone now, baked into the new operating system that can tell you about what your risk of falling is. You can imagine a time where you'll have sensors in your shoes and elsewhere that'll be measuring your gait speed, your forces of landing, et cetera, and then processing that. You can further imagine a time where the implants will be telemetried, and then we'll send biofeedback to the homogenized device, which will be the phone. The phone will be your electronic medical record of the future. It won't be in a file folder in my office right now locked behind a door. It'll be accessible to you, and then it'll be processing that information to say that, when you work out heavy on Tuesday and then you stay up late on Wednesday and you don't eat this on Thursday, you get a sore knee every Friday. That sort of thing will sort of start to guide us. And then finally, we'll have a lot more inputs at the time of surgery that will then need to be processed on the back end. Right now, there was an interesting that happened in the Vietnam War with the fighter pilots where they started to give them so much feedback for SAMs coming and squelches and things that the pilots started turning it off because they couldn't process it. Now the F-35 fighter, I think it does over 1 million flight controls a second, and if that computer went down, the plane would disintegrate in the air. There's no pilot that could keep up to it. So it's that sort of back-end processing that we're going to need to kind of get us to the next level of what you can do with all these fancy robots.
I think the aviation example is interesting. I mean, for me, I think because I don't see AI as a thing. You're not going to buy an AI. It's not going to come in a box. AI is a suite of technologies that enable things, right? So you mentioned perception and pattern rec, right? And that's a huge area, I think, where there's a lot of growth, and there will continue to be a lot of growth, right? Because as the people who started in data mining 10, 15, 25 years ago realized, oh, wow, you know what? If we mine through enough of this data, we realized that when a guy comes into a Walmart at 2 in the morning and he's buying Pampers, he likes to buy a case of beer, right? And then all of a sudden they can place those products and they made a ton of money off this, right? And that's the pattern rec capability that I think modern machine learning and data mining and AI in this case kind of brings to the game. I mean, we're seeing that right now with perception, but now we're starting to see decision making, right? We're a long ways away from the HAL that's going to sit there and say not now, Dave, or boot you out of the. You're Dave, so you're the guy that's outside the spaceship. I think we're still a long ways away from that, but you're right. It's ramping up, and it's ramping up fast. And I think using that capability in robotics allows the robot to deal with a situation it's not prepared for. Right? The automation is always good when you can plan every possible thing. The problem is the minute you put it in the water, the plan's changed, right? Yeah. And one of the most frustrating things as an underwater robotics guy is to put a robot in the water, and this has happened numerous times, and send it on a 6-hour mission, and realize that something had went wrong, and it only went 6 or 8 inches under the surface, and it did the whole mission. So I sat in a rubber boat, eating my lunch, waiting for this thing for 8 hours, and nothing happened. And those are the spots, like the fault tolerance. Something changed. It needs to react. Those are a spot where I think that there's a lot of potential in the future.
Well, the great philosopher Mike Tyson said to me that it's the same thing happens in the OR. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And, we probably get similar challenges where things like this happen. I'm also just reminded of what you say, if you don't mind me wanking on for a second. Protagoras said man is a measure of all things. And what our PhD students have done recently, combined with biomedical and computer science, is they've started to look at multidimensional space. And these same frequency distributions, we're only talking about a few of them now, these bell curves, but there would be hundreds of these curves that represent us as individuals intersecting in multidimensional space. And it's that processing that you're going to need to dissect those through and provide patterns that we can appreciate, as opposed to trying to interpret, the last one we looked at, we had a 23-dimensional graph. We had to transpose it through a self-organizing map down to 2-dimensional space. What came from it, though, was fascinating, is that we don't take linear pathways through pathology. We all have different sort of pathways, but those happen in clusters. And if you can identify what cluster, and then you can better predict and prescribe for where you're going to end up, as opposed to one-shop-fits-all kind of approach.
So one question that's here specifically on the Mako robot. Is there currently a way to set any of the calibration points of the Mako robot prior to surgery beginning? And what is the hardest part of actually using this robot?
Yeah, you can set all the parameters in terms of where you put things. It's a little bit hard to answer what the hardest part is. I mean, part of it is the epistemology. For example, right now, where we have an advantage in the United States because of the FDA, they're bounded. But they can only go so far outside of an envelope with this neutral alignment, because there's a paradox, because they're waiting for the outcomes. And so the research we talk about is OUS, meaning outside the United States, which is why we're going to have that leapfrogging effect, I think, of disproportionate contributions to say, when you do put it in an individualized position, where you put it. The hardest part, and what gets interesting, is the hardest part is fighting the robot. Because it pushes back on you, and it doesn't let you do things that intuitively you think you should be doing, but it stops you for safety reasons. And the hardest part is kind of getting used to working within that envelope train. And it's sort of a different haptic mindset about where to go with it. And that's clearly a learning curve. The studies that have been shown that the learning curve would be about 7 cases, but you're more accurate from your first case than you are without it. The learning curve is only about surgical time, set up, where to put the robot, where the nurse stands, things like that.
So Dave, you talked a little bit about sort of long endurance robotics, seabed resident robotics. So robots that are meant to be stationed underwater for a long period of time. How are you actually going to prevent sea life from growing, creating drag on the vehicles, and effectively reducing the capability of that vehicle?
So biofouling is probably the biggest problem to face with any of those systems. It's the same problem we face on our warships, the same problem you face on your kayak in your, out on the lake. In shallow water with light, coming in, and especially in warm waters, biofouling is a major challenge. There are environmentally friendly and not environmentally friendly ways to deal with that. There's the not environmentally friendly way. There's ablative paints. There's essentially putting copper into the water, which will kill anything it touches. It's not great for the environment, and it's not allowed in certain areas, but it's very common in the shipping industry. On the other side, there's been a lot of work being done in UV systems, which will actually inhibit the growth of significant biofouling, which is interesting. The downside of that is it requires a lot of power. Essentially, you have to have a whole bunch of lights turned on all the time in a docking station that's attached to the shore side, where you have a power source. It's fairly straightforward. Where you're trying to deploy a system. So we talk about taking a vehicle that's in 3,000 or 4,000 meters of water. That docking station, instead of being tethered to shore, it just has a ton of batteries in it or a fuel cell in it, and it lives there for a year. The robot goes out for a day or 2 days or a week, does its mission, comes back, recharges, and then eventually after a year you pop the cork and that whole thing comes up to the surface. In those types of applications where we don't have the amount of power necessary to do the UV systems, generally the trade-off is at those depths you don't have nearly as significant of a problem. One of the bigger challenges to underwater robots that isn't addressed until you start getting into that really long endurance is other creatures. Sharks really like robots. It's a weird thing. There's been a ton of research done at Woods Hole in this. Their whole mooring chain, or their mooring group that does long-term sea moorings, first discovered that sharks like steel. They like to chew on these steel cables, and they were finding all these moorings were being lost, and they were picking shark teeth out of them. there's a fantastic research project at Woods Hole called Shark Cam that the National Geographic funded. And they put a whole bunch of cameras onto a small robot. They put a tracking sonar on it, and they tagged a shark, and they made it chase a great white. And it got to the point where initially the great white didn't really get bothered. Eventually, the great white started hunting the robot. And if you've ever been in the water with one of these things, they're making a loud whirring sound because the prop is really annoying. But the shark would actually go down to the twilight, so down 100 meters-ish, and actually circle underneath the Remus, the vehicle, and come up and attack it, bite onto it. So that's a whole other aspect of this. And the question of, there's a kind of a moral question of, are we actually impacting the environment by deploying these vehicles? Thus far, there's so few of them that it's not really making a tangible impact, and we're adding more value than we're taking away. But yeah, there's a bunch of different aspects to think about in that long-term biology of those systems.
Probably not lost on you, of course, that Mako's a type of shark, right? And
I'm not worried about those ones.
no, but just the crossover, and it's always interesting traveling and listening to other lectures and stuff because of the cross-fertilization. So our biggest problem is biofouling too, in terms of infections. That's the one thing that we're losing ground on, is infections and joint prostheses, because we've got a large foreign body, and then bacteria form a glycocalyx, so a biofilm, much like in the bottom of your sink, and once it's on there, they're like a barnacle on a rock. You can't get antibiotics to them, and we often have to remove the implants. And so part of the solution is going to have to be electropassive or some sort of implants that prevent bacterial adhesion. And you could just again extrapolate this forward. A bone is really a piezoelectric calcium substrate. As you load it, it creates electrical current. That's why you form bones the way you do. You can see smart materials where you load the implant that creates an electric current that you could then capacitate in the implant, put a valence shell around it in the future. It's just going to be an incredible future for what we're going to be able to do. You could literally even put your iPhone on your knee and power it after you've walked down the street to get here. At the same time, that could also potentially prevent you from getting an infection. Could drive your pacemaker, like if you don't walk, your pacemaker stops, That'd be a good idea. Good
Easy there.
good cardiac health initiative, right?
Netflix killing thousands of people.
That's right.
So one of the ones that came up actually for you, Dave, that was kind of interesting is, are you networking multiple AUVs for specific missions and trying to use different sensor systems?
So the short answer is yes, absolutely. The slightly longer answer is it's complicated, because those same challenges that make robots hard underwater makes multiple robots even harder. How do you get them to communicate with one another? So because we don't have any RF, because we don't have any GPS communications or GPS positioning of the systems, we have to use acoustic modems typically, which are very, very low bandwidth, very high error rates. So you're trying to communicate between multiple vehicles, and the classical handshaking algorithms and retransmission, if you're corrupting packets, just don't work because you don't have enough bandwidth to be able to do that. And that's where the autonomy and the AI of making these systems much more reliant, much more reliable. And I'm delving into your whole area of research now, but really the multiple vehicle autonomy is really critical. And then the most critical part is relying on knowing you're going to have poor communications, building more autonomy into the platform so that they can communicate every once in a while with very poor data, encoding adding a bunch of encoding that hopefully will correct some of those errors. Yeah, it comes back to that AI piece as well.
That was one of the big challenges, and still will be until they change the way that robots can communicate underwater. Is, we talked about perception. We talked about taking all that information and turning it into, or taking all that data and turning it into information. That's like a compressive step, if you can imagine, right? So you might have gigs and gigs of sonar data that comes out, and you're turning it into small little bits of information or metadata about the thing you're interested in. That's something that we've tried to pass along to other robots, but even then it's challenging. Like, we talk in my talk in a couple of weeks. We've got this little graph, and it shows this is worse than 28.8 modems, right? This is a terrible way to communicate underwater because you're using the whole media. You're using the water itself as the communications media, and it means you have to do a lot more decision making, and sometimes you start doing tricks. Like one of the coolest papers I read in grad school was about ants, and ants change the environment, and that's how they communicate, right? Because, I guess, I don't know, maybe ants have a bunch of different languages. But by changing the environment, they can sort of start to pick up what's going on and infer from that. And that's some of the cool research that's starting to happen, right? By observing. A robot is watching what the other robots are doing, and then it can make its own tasks and make decisions based on that. So it's cool stuff.
Is it true that whales can communicate over hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers?
That wouldn't surprise me in the slightest.
Nature's figured some of that out, right? They're communicating information over long distances, probably intelligently, in some level of intelligence. So.
Well, some of the best things I think we've ever done has been based on bio-inspired concepts, right? Like people like to say, oh, neural networks, it's like the brain. No, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's nowhere near. But the concept that you come from there is, right? And we've gained so much just by looking at nature and trying to do things. And that's not just there. Look at modern aircraft design, right? The wings, modern aerodynamics has been fed so much by just looking at how these birds work, right? So I think there's definitely a lot to be learned yet by just looking around us. So there was a question, are there any cases where the haptic system in a surgical robot could fail? What fail-safes are in place to protect a patient in that case?
Yeah, you can lose, for example, the trackers, and if you lose the array, then the system becomes dumb again because it doesn't know where it is. So you can knock that off inadvertently, et cetera. And then that gets into a really interesting philosophical dilemma about how do you train the next generation of surgeons who are going to become increasingly dependent on this to deal with it if it goes down. And I frankly don't have the answer to that. We do it right now with our pilots by putting them at risk up in the bush, as I alluded to earlier, flying for thousands of hours, literally putting their life on the line in private, in single-engine planes flying supplies to northern camps in Canada. I don't know how we're going to get there, other than maybe simulation, further things like this, and rebuilding the redundancy in. But it's a challenging question as we step into that next foray. What's the transition zone for surgeons, right? Right now, the people myself, for example, I've been doing it for 20 years without a robot, so I'm okay. But my residents who go through and maybe say 5 years are going to know nothing but robotic surgery. So what are they going to do? And I don't know. That's part of what we work on.
It's kind of the navigation problem, right? We all have GPS now, right? So what happens if GPS doesn't work anymore? And all of a sudden people are trusting their nav systems in their cars and they're driving off cliffs and into old folks' homes and all those things I've seen on TV.
We might actually have to ask our wives for directions.
So I look at the amount of...
It'll never happen.
No, I guess so.
I look at the amount of guidance that you've got when you're working with these robotic systems, and it's telling you where to go, it's telling you what to remove, it's telling you how much to remove, and then it's telling you to stop when you get too far into it. And there's a point there where it drips of a perfect autonomous problem. Like you could essentially let it all run that route, run that path, because you're already trusting the robot to tell you what to do. But then there's that moral question of...
Yeah, that's very prescient of you, and that's what's in the wings right now is fully autonomous robots. But there's a socialization issue where we have to socialize both the surgeon and the patient to get used to that, right? And if you look at modern aviation, some of the most impactful crashes that have happened in the last 10 years have been pilot error, and we would have been better off not having the pilot in the conflict. Like the Air France coming from Rio de Janeiro, they flat stalled that airplane out of the air because the autopilot went off and they didn't know how to fly it. And the seawall accident in San Francisco a few years ago where they came in on a sunny day and smacked the seawall. That speaks to this training issue because the pilots had several thousand hours, but they had very little actual stick time and manual time flying airplanes. So, yeah, that's probably where we're going to head is fully autonomous. As I said, I see a day where the surgeon will sit behind a control room and could be managing multiple surgeries at once by putting the flight plan in and then just seeing what's happening. And again, I don't see that as apocalyptic at all. I see it as increasing safety and reducing error.
No, you're right. And I think in robotics, I mean, the field of autonomy is looking at stages of autonomy. You hear that all the time, right? Because nobody can really give you a good definition for what autonomy is. But it is, autonomy doesn't have to be taking over the job. Autonomy can help fill in the cracks, right? And you see that with space robotics a fair bit, right? Where the latency is super fast, but the robot still needs to respond quickly for whatever. And I think there's a middle ground, and I think that is probably the next step, which is going to be a lot more trustable in the short term, right? All right, so I'm going to rip through a couple more here because I know I recognize it's already 9:15 here. So one question that one question that popped up, I guess this one's for me. How big of an incision did they have to make to operate? Unless you guys got something, yeah. And how much of a scar did it leave? So there's actually, this is going to shock a few people, but there's 6 incisions on one side and there's 5 on the other. But they're only about this big, right? So, you know, if you look at the robot that was there, right, and everybody's heard of like a laparoscopic surgery, it's like surgery with chopsticks, or at least that's what it looks like to me. So it's the same thing, but the robot's doing it. So I you know, you heal really fast because you only have these little cuts, right? Itched like hell, but that's the thing. So you don't have that problem. So that's really why. One that just popped up for you, Michael. Being part of the Dahazi community, would you support the implementation of robotics in the medical curriculum?
Sure, absolutely. It's already happening with respect to multiple surgical disciplines, so I think that would be a challenge to bring it together and make it a center of excellence or known for that expertise. If we got together and worked collaboratively,